Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second webinar of the Policy Dialogue series organized by the Ethmigsurveydata project. My name is Marcello Caramia, and I will moderate this webinar. I'm one of the coordinators of the dissemination working group of Ethmigsurveydata with Elena Ambrosini from Sapienza University Rome, whom you can see there among speakers. And you can also see Laura Morales from CIASPO Paris, who is the central coordinator of the project, as well as Brinia, who coordinates at Reykjavik University. So our topic today is surveys for mapping migration paths, and we have three speakers. Laura Bartolini from the International Organization for Migration, who will present the IOM's displacement tracking matrix. We will then have Chris Boscheman from INED, the French Institute for Demography, and Philippe Bonner from Geneva University, who will give a presentation on measuring migration integration in Switzerland. Each of them will be speaking for about 20 minutes, after which there will be time for question and answers. And then you can type your question on the dedicated tool on Zoom. We will collect questions and then we will address them after the presentations, except in case of very specific questions, in which case we may ask speakers to respond during their own presentations or just after. But okay, without further ado, I would like to give the floor to the speakers, and thanks them once again for joining us today and contributing to the Policy Dialogue series. So we start with Laura Bartolini from the International Organization for Migration. Laura, please.
Thank you, Marcello, and thanks everybody. Thanks for the invitation. I'm sharing now my screen and see if it works. Or have some slides while I'm speaking. Maybe if you can tell me if it's working or not. Okay, thank you. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm Laura Bartolini. I'm based in the IOM office in Rome, which is a coordination office for the Mediterranean. And I'm working as a reference for the displacement tracking matrix project, which is something that is common and present in many IOM's missions and offices worldwide. And I'm telling you what DTM is. I would like to tell also especially what we are doing in Europe and what are we doing in terms of surveys, which is maybe the focus of the presentation today. DTM started in 24 for the Iraq, when it was first deployed and developed in Iraq, and it was thought as a toolkit for IOMs to be able to have certain methodologies fixed or coordinated with other partners in terms of data collection, to be able to provide the better tailored assistance and to be able to register the presence and flows of the target population that IOM usually assists, which is not always the same. So of course, having started with a focus on internally displaced persons, so internal migrants without going across international borders, then DTM also has spanned or has been also implemented and used to cover migrant population, which are maybe those more commonly seen and assisted for the European region in general. Of course, depending on the kind of context, the type of country, the type in terms of IOM presence in the country, the data that normally IOM collects through DTM tools can focus on needs of the populations. So in terms of intersectoral needs, so in coordination with other UN agency and the humanitarian assistance, which is present in some crisis contexts, but also can be used to map location, to map population in general, so to have an estimate, to give an estimation of the size and structure of populations in places and locations where these official authorities or official sources are not present. We can also, and this is more common and more frequent for Europe, we can also monitor with DTM tools flows of cross-border movements in general. Last year we were in 86 countries or worldwide. Of course, the presence changes and the type of implementation that DTM has changes a lot. Of course, the situation that can be interesting and needed for Spain is not the same that one for Venezuela or Iraq or Somalia. So it's really a toolbox which is then implemented and takes shape depending on the context at the country level. We have some basic principles that are shared for everyone and for in an emission, and this is more data core principles even besides the DTM project per se. Normally and most frequently, data collected by DTM are not are anonymous and are not shared or produced in a way that personally identifiable information is needed nor collected. When this is the case, instead, we try to use as much as possible all the safeguards we have technically and institutionally that we can have to protect, of course, the data, the personal information of our beneficiaries. We try also to collect only the information that is relevant and to don't burden beneficiaries. This is a normal statement. I mean, it's something that should be taken for granted, but in many cases, this translates into trying to find a way to cooperate with all the agencies and international actors in order to avoid duplicating efforts, but to have reliable figures that can be used by many actors for their own activities and their own projects. So that, for example, we are not counting 10 times how many children we have to provide them schools, wash services, and then protection from trafficking, and then also maybe non-food items. So because this is done by different agencies or with different actors in the same place. The methodological framework that the general frameworks that have been developed centrally, of course, they are detailed at the country level, but we try as much as possible to use common definitions to allow for comparabilities across geographical areas and over time. And we also have developed some certain tools to be able to explain what we can do and can offer to other agencies in terms always of primary support and provision of services to beneficiaries of international interventions. So for as much as possible, we try to be very precise and quality oriented, but of course, this is not an academic effort and it's not a research, a pure research effort. And so the balance between providing timely data and providing quality and reliable data is always a struggle, and it's always something that we try to find an equilibrium for. You can find our public online presence, so the kind of data that we are able as an institution to share publicly with everyone online is collected and shared through some portals. The blue one, the displacement one, is dedicated to the data that are collected on IDPs mainly, so it's displacement.iom.int, while we have another portal for migrant population, so the monitoring of migration flows. Some data are for internal purposes only, others are visible. Then last year in 2020, the third big monster has born, because with COVID-19 we started also to collect using the already established DTM presence. We have started collecting information on points of entry, so land borders, sea borders or air borders, to update the operational status, so the openness or closure of different borders for different kinds of populations. And you have it on this third big portal. I will share the slides, and maybe, all hyperlinks are active. On Europe, more specifically, you can Google it now or later. We have this portal which is dedicated to Europe and especially to the Mediterranean region. And this is the repository where we provide updates on figures on arrivals and transit. We count as arrivals to Europe, so to the European Union, arrivals traced in Spain, Italy, Malta, Greece, Cyprus, and Bulgaria, while the light blue bubbles that you see on the screenshot refer to Western Balkans and Eastern European, even EU countries, which are used as more likely as transit countries. And we don't sum them up because to avoid as much as possible double counting of the same person crossing multiple borders. The portal also collects and shares figures on migrants in reception centers, on their most frequent national groups, and also you have on the bottom bar, you have the possibility to access reports, data set in Excel that are shared quarterly, and different type of data visualization. Within all this, let's say that this kind of exercise that is done by DTM with the help of colleagues of IOM and national authorities that provide us with their official representation and estimation of the phenomenon of arrivals by sea and by land. We use this base of information to also build our own primary data collection. So the survey, the collection of surveys with migrants that are traveling through these routes to Europe. And we do this with what we call flow monitoring surveys, which are surveys which are also deployed in other regions and in other contexts. But let's say we have a core component that is common to everyone, where we try to have to depict the demographics and the socioeconomic profiles of those that we are meeting. We collect information on reasons for moving, intended destinations, the type of travel and the routes they have taken to reach the country where they are met. And we also have specific sections dedicated to to some indicators of abuse, violence, exploitation, and incidents that for us as an humanitarian agency are relevant in terms of protection services that we can offer or contribution to the countries and the authorities where we are. There are also additional components. So of course the questionnaire has been over time has been revised, but we are trying to keep it consistent since regionally, to deploy always the same version in all countries, and also to add in some specific contexts modules that may be relevant for some missions and for others. So we have had some questions related to the interest of awareness in return options through dedicated voluntary services. We have some questions sometimes on the condition of those interviewed in the country of destination. And last year we had some questions related to the COVID situation and the impact that COVID had on mobility of the interviewees. As you see from the table below, which is very badly formatted, but I hope it's readable. you see that over time, we started with the so-called refugee crisis or migrant crisis of 2015 in Europe, but the countries we have covered with the TM flow monitoring surveys, and the years, I mean, have changed over the years, and this is both because of different access that we have had to field, but also of the type of interest that we had in terms of IOM presence and involvement in the management of arrivals by land and by sea. Numbers are overall decreasing because also arrivals are overall decreasing. So it's not that we were not that we wanted to decrease in 2018 or 19 the number of surveys on our side. Of course, 2020 is very small because we postponed the field until the end of the year. We had only a very short time for the data collection in November and December in Spain and Italy last year because we couldn't ensure access and safety and security for our staff in other countries during the year due to COVID mainly. But you can, for this effort, from this effort, you can see that, of course, we have been doing this with a lot of trained enumerators who have multiple language skills, and we had also the questionnaire translated in many languages, so it's not only English, French, Italian and Spanish, but we have built paper format, and we are using colleagues that can speak also many other non-European languages. Over time, we have built a mapping of the most frequently used entry, transit, and exit location for irregular migratory moves. And we try to always have the consent from local authorities to access not only the open spaces which are available, but also reception centers and different types of landing points for disembarkation mainly. We propose interviews in a voluntary and anonymous way, so we are not collecting personally identifiable data. And since we are also interviewing migrants where they are almost, likely to be moving soon from the place where we meet them, it's very unlikely that we can retrace back those that we met. And we are using a server to store everything and to allow for comparison and sharing of data sets across countries. Of course, we are very well aware that there are a lot of limitations in our exercise. We try always to refine and to be as much as precise as possible, but depending on the country, if the reference population at first is not known, it's very difficult to build a sampling strategy that can be deemed as representative. We also have time and resource constraints as everyone, I know, in the choice of the countries and in the time that we can spend in doing this, which is a very an exercise that is very detached from everything else IOM does in terms of distribution of services, of provision of services. And we also have to recognize that migrants that we are meeting, although we are not, we are open to interview everyone above the age of 14 and everyone that is traveling in these ways and who is not an European national. We are very well aware that we have a restricted access to certain locations where we are more likely to find children, unaccompanied children, or more vulnerable groups like women alone or victims of trafficking, which are in dedicated services where we are not entering and we are not trying to enter for this kind of exercise. So there are some, of course, there are many different methodological issues to be acknowledged, but still it's very relevant for us. And the reason why we do this is, at least for Europe, is to have, there are many reasons, but I would like to maybe to stress some of those. One is that since IOM is already present with cultural mediators, legal operators, protection officers, we already have a lot of anecdotal and qualitative information of what is happening on the ground and what are the main issues and the main profiles of those that we are assisting. But this exercise allows us to have quantitative measurement of the most common experiences which are related and linked to possible protection concerns and hence to possible actions and activities that we can recommend or propose or to local authorities. Also, not only we are trying to identify what we can do best or better or what are the gaps in our actions, but this also gives us a good starting point to start discussing with other authorities and with our partners and UN agencies and other international actors in terms of coordination of what is more needed, also in terms of advocacy and policy recommendation, in this case, vis-a-vis the European countries. This is just an example. I'm not presenting results per se, but just to give you a grasp of what can be extracted from these data sets. And this, I think, was a table with 2019 or 2018 results. So it's not even new, but it's just that to show you that these data sets allow us to have a comparison across routes, across the nationalities of those that we are interviewing, across we are collecting also information on where the most big and relevant incidents have been experienced. We are trying to understand whether there are correlations or some indicative patterns in terms of what is happening in one country to certain nationalities or certain groups, etc. And also we have a lot of different products that we have and that are available for external, for the external public and for our partners. I just put some screenshots of some reports that we have produced. So these are examples of the fact that we can have some publication without focusing only on one country. So what is arriving to Italy in terms of the main nationalities, the main profiles of those arriving, or the main issues they have encountered, depending on whether they have departed from Libya or from Tunisia or from Turkey. But we can also look at only women everywhere, or only children, or only the trafficking indicators, because someone is more interested in some specific work on vulnerabilities. We have interest of countries of origin. So maybe the Pakistani authorities have asked IOM in Pakistan to tell them who are the Pakistanis who are going, or if they are different from those that they are supporting in transnational migration regularly. So the kind of things that we can do are quite flexible and adaptable to also the information needs that that are expressed by our partners and the authorities we are collaborating with. I think, yes, maybe just 1 second and then I'm closing. This is my last slide. To say that for children in particular and in Europe, we have been working a lot together, UNICEF and UNHCR, trying to use this kind of evidence that has been collected with adolescents between 14 and 17 years old across Europe to better inform the figures on arrivals of children to Europe and detention or reception of children to Europe, because this is, of course, this is a joint interest, so it's a population that is of interest for IOM in terms of migrant, for UNHCR in terms of asylum seekers and refugees, and UNICEF because they are children. So this is something that it's interesting for Europe because it's really interesting, I think, to see how different countries are behaving and integrating children, migrant children in their own reception and integration of children and protection activities and framework. I stop here, but I'm very happy to listen to the other speakers and to reply to questions if there are any later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. So like I said, we're collecting questions, but then we will ask them after the third presentation, unless there is some particularly timely or specific question, in which case we can interrupt. We'll take the liberty of interrupting you. So now I will invite Chris to share his presentation. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me and can you see my PowerPoint presentation? Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to give this presentation on the trajectories and origin survey that were made in France. And the subtitle is Beyond the Immigration Bias, and I will explain later why I want to say a few words about that. So first, some basic information on the main features of the survey. So TEO stands for Trajectories and Origins, and these surveys are the result of a collaboration between ENET and INSEE, which means that this is both a research survey, but it's also a very official survey carried out with this National Institute of Statistics in France. So the core population of these surveys are the immigrants and their descendants, mainly the first generation, those who immigrated in France, their children, and also in the second TEO survey, the third generation, meaning the grandchildren of the immigrants. And the core research question of this project is, what is the influence of origins on living conditions and social trajectories, with, of course, a special interest on inequalities and to what extent these inequalities that we can measure between different groups are the result of discriminations. There are two rounds of this TEO survey. The first one was done in 2008 and 2009. The second survey TEO just occurred. We finished recently the field work, and the data will be available in 22. And it might be in the future that within a decade, there would be a third survey. Importantly, however, what should be noticed is that this is not a panel survey. So each survey is independent from the previous one. So the samples are independent, but still there are most of the questions are common from a round to the other. These are very large surveys. Where they were in the first survey, there was 18,000 interviewees and 28,000 interviewees in the last one. This is the samples are nationally representative of the whole mainland France population. And I won't enter into the details of how we sampled the interviewees, but it's quite complicated for the second and third generation, especially. And what is important is that there are some groups that are overrepresented, the main international migrants groups in France, but also nationals originating from the current and past overseas territories. This is a multi-topic survey. And here you can see all the titles of the modules that are included in the questionnaire, which is a quite long questionnaire. It takes like 1 hour on average to answer the survey. And the main topics are access to socioeconomic resources, like education, housing, employment. Some questions, a lot of questions actually on origin and cultural background, for instance, religion, language, sense of belonging, etc. Questions on subjective questions on the experience of discrimination, and also several modules that relate to family and social environment. So when we coming back to the title of this webinar, migration path, what we can do with the Theo surveys about migration path is related to the fact that while this is a cross-sectional survey, we collect retrospective information on the interviewees' trajectories, meaning socioeconomic trajectories, for instance, on education and employment. We have also family histories related to partnerships and children. We have migration trajectories since birth. And using this kind of information, most of the analysis that were done using Theo 1, the first survey, was to compare the first and second generation to give insights on the intergenerational path of integration, basically thinking about the assimilation story, how things happen for the second generation compared to the first generation. And the main results, and there are many publications on various topics that I mentioned earlier, but the main results are that there is a general path of social cultural assimilation. If you look at, for instance, the percentage of mixed marriage, or the social relationship, or the feelings of Frenchness, everything, all these social cultural indicators of integration progress from a generation to the next. For all groups almost. But on the other hand, there is a very unequal path of socioeconomic integration with a lot of difficulties for the second non-European generation. And this is very consistent when we look at objective indicators such as, I don't know, employment, the rates of unemployment, for instance, or earnings, or also levels of education. So this is consistent for most socioeconomic indicators, objective socioeconomic indicators, but also for the more subjective questions related to the experience of discrimination. So since we have this discrepancy between non-European and European children of migrants, the big question that we have for the second Theo survey is what happens to the next generation? To what extent do we see that it is becoming worse and worse for the new generations, or is there a kind of rebound for grandchildren of non-European migrants? So this is the big question mark for this new survey, but we don't still have we still do not have the results, so we'll need to wait a bit. And it has to be said also that the sample for the third generation is not as big as we would have liked, so results will maybe not be that reliable as for the second generation. Another way at looking at migration path with these surveys is to look specifically at the migration trajectories. And regarding to this question of migratory trajectories, we recorded all stays from birth until the time of the survey of all interviewees, meaning that we looked at the countries where they lived at least 12 months. And furthermore, for the immigrants themselves, we have, especially in the second Theo survey, a lot of information on their legal trajectories. And our project is to study to what extent these legal trajectories will impact integration trajectories. So we have information on the type of visa upon entry, the type of first residence permit versus also the current residence permits. We know whether they requested asylum and whether they obtained the refugee status. And I did not mention it earlier, but we try to oversample refugees. And we have also, and this is pretty important, I think, especially because this is a very official survey. We have also information on the experience of being undocumented. So we asked the interviewees who were migrants whether at some point in their life they were undocumented and how long it lasted. And we also asked to the second generation interviewees whether their parents at some point were undocumented. And we want to document the effects of these experiences. And so this is related to the immigrants. And what I will insist more in the rest of my presentation is is these ideas of looking at migration beyond the immigration bias. What do I mean when I say immigration bias? When we talk about immigration, there is really like an obsession, let's say, towards immigration, looking at migrants as only from the destination point of view, overlooking the fact that migrants may move again, either going to another country or returning to their own country. Overlooking quite often the fact that nationals in destination countries are also potential movers. Paying insufficient attention to people who are expected to migrate, but who do not migrate. And when I say this, I have in mind some, especially some studies that we did with Theo, but also with other surveys on family reunification. There is this idea in Europe that family migration is really a major path of entry. And we have measures of family migration, especially using information through residence permits in different countries. But there are few information on people who could come using reunification channels and who do not come. And actually, this is something on which we have some information on Theo. So I'm going to give you a few snapshots of results about migratory path out of this just immigration focus. So first, this table is to show that migration is a frequent experience also for people who are not immigrants themselves. And here you have two categories of individuals: those who are born out of mainland France. Some are immigrants, foreigners are immigrants as in the French definition, meaning that they were foreigners at birth. But you have also many other people who were born outside France, but still being French, especially people from the former colonies. So born out of France, born in mainland France, and these people born in mainland France may be immigrants' children, other natives with a migration background, for instance, people, the children of repatriates, or other natives which have no direct migration background. What is interesting here is that you can see that among immigrants' children, for instance, 11% lived at some point. So they were surveyed in France, in Theo, but 11% of them lived at some point for at least 1 year out of France. The proportion is 13 among natives with migration background, and 7% among people who are born in France without migration background. And finally, if you count up all these people who are living in France at the time of that survey, but who at some point lived out of mainland France, you have a third of all migrants out of mainland France who were born in France. So migration and long distance migration, including international migration, is a very common experience, including for people who are not immigrants. And I think it's very important to have this in mind, because in the perception of international migration in Europe, there is often this idea of invasion of immigrants coming and coming and coming, never going out, and also another look at the fact that nationals are also potential out migrants. And I think this is very important to try to show this in our surveys on migration. Another snapshot here is on out-migration intentions. So it comes from a paper by Louise Caron. I just mentioned the source here at the bottom of the slide. And here in brackets, you have the percentage of people who said, yes, I intend to return to my origin country. So this is the case for more than 11% for the first generation, 6% for the second generation. And here is the percentages of people who said, yes, I want to leave France to go somewhere else, not in my origin country. And you can see that it augments by generation of migration. And what's interesting also is that when Louise Caron modeled these intentions of return or onward migration to control for social characteristics, age, and so on, she noticed that actually people from the second generation were equally likely of declaring that they wanted to move out of France than the first generation. So this is something quite common. And what is really interesting in her work also is that she showed that discrimination is a major driver for this declaration of migration intentions. And so what's interesting here is not really to what extent intentions are a predictor of actual migration, but it's rather that intention should be taken as a kind of integration indicator. It says something about how people feel in the country where they live. Another snapshot, again, on something else than immigration. This relates to the circulation of immigrants' children. So it comes from people who were interviewed as children of migrants. So they were surveyed in France again. And we looked at the proportion of those who, before they turned 18, lived at some point at least 1 year out of France. You can see that on average, this is 5%, both for boys and girls, females and males. And you can see that there are huge differences according to the origin. And you can see that for sub-Saharan boys, especially, the proportion is more than 20, meaning that there are, among the African second generation in France, one man out of 5 lived at least 1 year abroad, mainly in the origin country, and more often than that without their parents. And actually, this is linked to the, let's say, social anthropological context, to the fact that the extended family is able to take care of the children in these countries. The reason why migrants tend to send back to their home country their children relates to the idea of protecting the children against racism, and it relates to what I just showed before about discrimination and intentions of migration. It's also about family and social controls, especially when boys have problems with delinquency, for instance, etc. So parents tend to send back the children so that they are able to better monitor their lives than in the context of the French society. It's also about maintaining cultural ties for their children. What we don't know, because we did not study it so far, is what are the effects of these stays out of France on the future of the second generation? What happens next? To what extent they have better or worse outcomes in their adult lives? But still, again, this is very important to take into account. I think these experiences of international migration that are usually overlooked. Here, it's about children non-reunification. So before I talked about circulation, intention of migration out of France. And here I turn to this idea of non-immigration. So, and again, having in mind that in Europe, family migration is seen as a major channel of immigration, and since the 90s, all countries all over Europe tend to decide more and more restrictive policies because they have in mind that family migration is really the big channel of entry. So here, what you can see on this graph is the percentage of left behind children and how this percentage evolves over time. So this is about the children who were born abroad out of France before their parents migrate. So when it starts here at time 0, when the parent migrate, and here you have the proportion of those who migrate with the proportion of children who migrate with their parents, and here the proportion of those who were left behind when the parents migrated. So it shows that about 60% of all children were left behind at the time of departure, which is quite a high proportion. And you can see how this proportion of those who were left behind evolved over time. So after 2.5 years, you have 50% of all children who who live with their parents, meaning that the other half is still left behind. And 10 years after separation due to migration of the parents, 2/3 are reunified and still 1/3 is still living abroad. There are some differences by origin, and again, with Sub-Saharan Africa being a place where children tend to be left behind more often than in other places, than in other regions of the world. And analysis have shown that this high proportion of children who are still left behind after 10 years is due both to policy constraints and also to migrants' preferences, with some families preferring to leave their children behind with other members of the family. And again, it shows that, to me, what is important is that reunification is not systematic. So immigration is certainly important, but it is also important to keep in mind that when migration can occur, especially for children due to the right of family reunification, it's not systematic at all. So to conclude, beyond immigration and including in surveys that are dedicated to immigrants and their children, it's important to never forget the opposites of immigration, meaning out-migration, and also non-migration when people have the right to migrate. And it's also important to keep in mind the mobility pattern of non-immigrants, especially of the nationals, because in public opinions, having in mind that nationals can be migrants in other countries in the world may impact the way they consider immigrants in their own country. Thank you. And if you want more information on these TEO surveys, you can go and see the websites. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris, for this very interesting presentation. We do have some questions, but again, we will keep them for later. So I would invite Philippe to share his presentation.
Okay. Thank you very much for your invitation to present the Migration Mobility Survey. I don't want to present some results, but rather how we organize this survey. Perhaps some elements to contextualize. Switzerland is a country of immigration with a diversification of migration flows since the beginning of this century. And there is also a radicalization of the political discourse. In this context, the Swiss government funded a national research program on migration and mobility in 2014, which is a 12-year program grouping 60 researchers from different universities with qualitative and quantitative approaches. And one of the objectives of this program, the NCCR on the Move, was to document migration in Switzerland using quantitative approaches based, for instance, on population registers, and we developed a demographic database, and also based on a longitudinal survey that I want to present you. It's the Migration Mobility Survey. So this survey was organized first in 2016, and it is organized every 2 years. So we just finished the third wave. It concerns a specific group of migrants. The inclusion criteria are to be born abroad with a foreign citizenship at the time of the survey, age 24 to 64, but arrived in Switzerland at the age of 18 or more. We wanted to have people that decided to migrate from themselves and to avoid to have some children. They should be in Switzerland for less than 12 years of residence, And we excluded the asylum seekers because we considered that our questionnaire was not adapted for this group. There are other surveys for the group of asylum seekers in Switzerland. The sample is the following. We considered the first wave in 2016 as a kind of test, and we stratified the survey using 11 strats with a selection of citizenships. The objective was to reach approximately 400 interviews per strat. That means 4,400 people. But finally, we almost interviewed 6,000 people. Among them, more than 4,000 agreed to be contacted for a second survey. That means that they belong to our panel. 2 years after, in 2018, we developed the second survey and defined 17 strats representing all citizenships living in Switzerland. We expected to increase the number of participants to 6,800, but finally we obtained 7,700 migrants who took part to the survey. Among them, 2,000 were members of the panel. That means that they already answered in 2016. We can observe that there is a high attrition rate. We lost more than 50% of the panelists, which is due to the international migration. And we just finished in 2020 the third wave of this survey with approximately the same numbers of participants and a little more members of the panel, but it's difficult to keep those people because they are very mobile. Just to explain the problem of the attrition and the return rate, I show you a graph based on the linkage of our survey with the Swiss population register. That means that we organized the survey in June 2016, and we checked in the population register in December 2017, which is the status of the members of the panel. We can observe that there is a return rate that is very high. For instance, for the holder of a short-term permit in Switzerland, more than 40% are left Switzerland meantime. That means that we are not able to follow them and to interview them again. And it's the case for certain specific citizenships. For instance, Indian population in Switzerland, most of them are scholars living in Zurich or in Lausanne near the universities, and they are very frequently returning back to their country. So it's difficult to maintain them in the panel. We have some strategies regarding the fidelization of our participants. Particularly, we try to invite them using their language of origin. That means that we have letters. We send letters in 6 languages. We propose an online survey with the possibility to answer by phone, and we organize different recall, in particular for the panelists who have the information of their email address, so it's easier to recall them to participate to the survey. We also organize some information, a panel care letter every year, etc. The questionnaire of the survey, we have a part of screening which guarantee that the people are entitled to participate to the survey. After that, we ask them some question of the migration history. the number of moves, the reason to migrate in Switzerland, the support for migration, some question regarding the citizenship and the intention to apply for the Swiss citizenship, the education, highest level of education, the country of education, the employment status before, just after the migration, and also the current employment status, the skill mismatch, the contract type, the family configuration, the integration in terms of language skills, the ties with the country of origin, the social participation in Switzerland, the interest for the news in Switzerland, etc. And finally, the life in Switzerland, satisfaction with the migration decision, discrimination, intention to stay or return. And in 2023, we also asked some question on the impact of the COVID-19 on the living condition in Switzerland, in particular regarding the way they lived the first lockdown and their satisfaction with the decision of Switzerland in terms of the monitoring of the COVID. Regarding the diffusion of this survey, the results are presented in our website. You have the website address. We try to develop some longitudinal indicators. We also did some publication. We wrote a Springer book based on this survey in 2018, and we write, of course, some scientific paper. We just recently developed a website for pupils, for college students and bachelor, which invite them to use the survey, to play with the data, and we implement this website in some schools, notably in the region of Geneva. The data is free, and scholars are invited to use it. So we just have to write an email, and we send them the data. For the future, we will organize a fourth wave in 2022. We are discussing with the Swiss National Fund for Research for a grant to continue in 2024 and 2026. From 2028 onward, we will try to ensure the continuity of the survey by inserting it in a Swiss administration. We are not able to continue after the end of our research program, so we will try to request a kind of cooperation with the Swiss Federal Statistical Office or the Swiss Office for Foreigners to ensure the continuity of the survey. And finally, we also plan to survey the re-immigrated panelists in 2023, because we have the information of the fact that they left Switzerland, we know where they are, and we also have some information of their email address. So we expect to have a good coverage of those people when they will be surveyed in terms of the long-term consequences of the stay in Switzerland, why they return back to the country, or why they did onward migration. For more information, you can contact me, send me an email, and I will provide you some more information. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Philippe. Also perfect timing, all of you, so thanks for that as well. We have one question which I can see Laura asked a clarification. I also wasn't sure. The question is if there are surveys to know which countries Spanish immigrant population go to by gender, but it's not fully clear whether it's Spanish immigrants or Spanish emigrants. So while we seek a clarification, I think maybe this may be a question for Laura. You can keep it maybe if you think this is something, Laura Bartolini, sorry, if you think this is something you can maybe advise on. If we can break the ice, I may have a question myself as well. Starting with Laura, but then again, maybe Elena and Laura Morales also, you're welcome to ask if you want, or I can do. Okay, I will go first. I just have a simple question for Laura, most of all. So I found it very, very impressive. Congratulations. This is a huge project, and I think it's important that you presented it because for what I hear, people in the academic world are not very much aware of these surveys, which are a bit more familiar to people working in policy or in agencies, organizations, and so forth. And I think the balance between relevance and quality that you achieve is very impressive. I have a question about your sampling, let's call it like that, but I don't want to make it a pedantic question on sampling frames or representativeness. I know you're mapping a flow, and it's very difficult to even define what the reference population is. But I was wondering if you ever analyzed, if you ever compared the structure, let's say, of the population in your sample with some kind of overarching population, migrant population in Europe or in some countries, in particular, if you have any information on that. And then maybe a question which may be of interest to our audience as well. What is available exactly to the public? I know for sure there are some dashboards online which are already incredibly useful, and I was wondering if there is also something else that IOM shares, although I know all the constraints that you have. And then a small question, you mentioned that you downscaled the survey a little bit in 2020 because of COVID, of course. So I was wondering what is the state of play now in 2021, if you upscaled again or plan to. And that's it, thank you. So maybe we can see if we have other questions or otherwise we can make already first round of answers.
As you wish, I can go and see if if I'm able to reply to everything. So for the sampling, yes, we try to match the final sample we are getting in each country with the data we are receiving from national authorities of arrivals by land and by sea. So for example, for Italy, we know that the sample in Italy, the top 5 nationalities are the top 5 nationalities each year that arrive by sea. We know that the share of women is very low, but it's okay to be very low because there are less women in arrivals by sea. For Spain, the Minister of Interior only shares data on arrivals by sea, but nothing by land. And all land arrivals to Ceuta and Melilla are quite relevant, not only yesterday or the last week, but in general, they are not zero. So it depends a lot of what you are looking for and what you can cover. But for example, in Spain, we try to distinguish both last year in 2019, we have a distinction between those arriving through the Canary Islands and those arriving through the Mediterranean routes. And again, the nationalities are different, and we can a bit try to, we have a comparison. It's not perfect, and we can't, and we also can't say to enumerators where they are in the field to not speak with Malians because we have too many, just because the constraints they have in terms of we have to reach a certain number of surveys in a certain number of weeks. For them and the way our work is done, it's very strict. But still, we are trying to make it reasonable in terms of final data. And I think this is easier for Italy and Spain, less easy for Western Balkan countries in general. And this depends, it's even more difficult because there the flows is really constant. It's really a flow. It's not that you are collecting and speaking with a population that is stable at least for some time or some months. So even comparing what you are meeting at some point with what. So the last 2 years of the data that you know, that you tracked in terms of transits, it poses some difficulties. And the same is true, for example, when we try to have a focus on land arrivals to Italy, which are, again, it should be the last part of the Eastern Mediterranean route. But then if you meet someone in Milan, can come and pass through Milan through different routes and with different motivations. And maybe we have also someone, it's really, we can try to justificate or to compare and to make it explicit, the type of sample we have, but for sure it cannot pretend to be representative in academic terms, let's say. For the availability, yes, there are dashboards, there are reports, there are no data sets online, but we can have agreements to share the data sets with external institutions or external researchers. We have done so in the past, but still for us, sharing a data set, even though it is anonymized and even though maybe I can take out the locations and leave only the provinces or regions to further anonymize it, still it requires for us to sign an official exchange agreement of data sharing for the institution, which it's no reason not to try, because of course this kind of information is made to be used, but we are also very conscious that since we are a small portion of the very big portfolio of activities of IOM, it can for sure be that there are some things that we are not even able to use. And I'm contradicting myself, but it's just like that you are trying to have a survey and a questionnaire that is more comprehensive as possible, but then you're allowed to, or you have time to focus on certain reports and certain analysis, but not everything. So for sure that there may be room for further analysis and ways of look into the data sets. For the future, this is a nice question, but I don't have the answer because as everything in IOM, also the DTM is a project funded by external partners. So we are project-based, we raise funds with, and the DTM Europe over the past 5 years was funded by the former DFID, and now it's becoming challenging to get a renewal or a reformulation of this activity. And this is also because, again, Europe is not a humanitarian context. Europe is not the DTM in Libya, of course, maybe is more famous, is bigger, is more financed, and there is a reason, of course. I'm not complaining for that, but I think it's also nice and should be, I mean, we are trying to keep it open, also this European look on migration flows, because it's the end of many other efforts that our colleagues within IOM and others are doing in other regions. So even connecting the dots between different, with Western and Central Africa analysis and data sets, or Northern Africa, or I don't know, it's the sub-Indian continent. I mean, there is a reason for having also Europe, even though migration flows to Europe are irrelevant in terms of number if you see it like globally, it's very small what we are speaking about. I mean, it's 40,000 people now for Europe as a whole. It's nothing. It's nothing. I mean, of course, it's something in policy terms, but it's the numbers we are dealing with in other contexts are so higher, and the needs of the persons that we are assisting in other contexts are so. I mean, it's incomparable. I don't know if I'm making myself understood. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Laura. I was actually reading a question by Chris himself. Do you want to ask it loud to yourself, Chris, maybe?
Yes, it was a question for Philippe. I was curious about this website you mentioned that you designed for pupils, because I think when we work on immigration, most of us have in mind the attitudes of public opinion towards immigrants, and trying to better inform policymakers and the general public is something very important, but sometimes we're short of good ideas on how to educate properly on our subject. So I was curious about what you've done in this matter.
Yes, I shared the website, in fact, whose name is Polyscope. For the moment, it is in French, but we will translate it in German and Italian because they are the national languages in Switzerland. And in fact, we have some scenarios in this website, and the pupils are invited to visit those scenarios that represent, for instance, different migrants in Switzerland who cross the border, who are arriving with their as asylum seekers or as economic migrants with their parents, etc. And they can discuss those scenarios together in the classrooms. Generally, the classes inscribe themselves to small seances from 1 to 2 hours, and we organize those seances with an assistant. So it's very convivial. And it's a way to explain to the young people in Switzerland that migration is not only what we hear in the press, but it's also some kind of different trajectories from different people arriving from different countries around the world, etc. And it's a nice job to do it, because we meet children from 12 to 16 years old, and they can play also with the data.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Sorry, I was muted. I was just saying, I think Elena has a question as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Marcello, and thank you to all the three speakers for the very insightful presentations. And I have a question for Chris and one for Philippe. That is more or less about the same topic, but for Chris, you mentioned that discrimination is one of the main reasons behind leaving France, okay, re-immigrating or coming back home. So I was wondering, how do you measure discrimination? And you mentioned that you have indicators in the second survey of well-being. You have subjective well-being, such as life satisfaction, job satisfaction, and so on. I was just curious, because I think in the first one there was nothing about that, but if I remember well. Yeah, so that's my question. Thank you.
About discrimination first, there are many questions in the questionnaire about discrimination. There are discrimination questions about specific situations, like, okay, you were looking for a job were you discriminated, or were you discriminated at school, etc. So in very specific situations, and there is a kind of overall declaration of discrimination within the last 5 years, and this variable that was used by Louise Caron to try to understand the drivers of migration intentions. And there are also questions about the experience of racism. So there are many questions about that. About subjective well-being, I don't think we have such a question on the general well-being. We may have, maybe in the first year, we may have had a question about a general assessment of the earnings, whether it was more than enough to live properly, or, but I can't remember exactly. And until the second, I don't think we have such a question.
May I go for the question for Philippe? I was wondering when the survey 2020 will be available, because I'm very much interested in the COVID-19 section, as most of us are now researching about that. So.
Yes, it's already available, and I can send you some results regarding this module. And also, if you want the data, you can contact me, and there is no problem. I send you after the results, some results. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay.
I think we had a clarification from Soledad Escobar, who was asking about immigrants to Spain, so migrants from other countries residing in Spain who re-emigrate or return to their, so migrants residing in Spain and leaving. And the question was whether we are aware of data on this migrant population by gender. So that's a pretty specific question. I'm not sure if any of the panelists can answer this.
Yeah, Laura?
Yeah, maybe, so DTM, at least IOM, is looking at migrants from outside the EU that are residing or are arriving, not residing, in Spain in particular. So we have nationalities, and we try to get nationalities of arrival of migrants to Spain, which may be, I don't know, Morocco, Algeria, and Western African nationalities mainly. They do not include, of course, arrivals, regular arrivals, and also maybe overstayers or, I don't know, nationalities that can fly to Spain, and then they may become irregular, which may be the case of some Latin American countries and nationalities. We are also seeing, for example, during the COVID, at the very beginning of the pandemic last year, it was clear that there were a lot of Moroccans who would have gone back to Morocco, and they were looking for regular ways of going back with ferries, but it was not possible for them. And then there were some flights and some special ferries to bring them back, because they realized they couldn't stay without doing nothing in Spain. So it was preferable for them to go back, at least temporarily. The same applies for many other countries or other nationalities that have tried to move during last year to reply or to copy with the fact that they were stopped in their normal way in working activities. On the other way, we know, but we don't track, because this is regular again, and this is supported and managed by national authorities. But European countries have organized special flights and special arrivals of migrants to Europe in last summer to try to manage the fact that normal ways of managing seasonal working activities was disrupted in some sense by the COVID pandemic and by the mobility restriction that were applicable in theory to all mobile persons, regardless of their status. For Spain, maybe I would say that we also know, and this is valid for Spain and Italy, I would say in equal terms, that we have movements again from Spain and Italy onwards to other European countries. We also have, we track them. We are not publishing anything specific about this population because it's not something that we can do on a regular basis and with in terms that can be significant or internal. It's not that IOM wants to produce numbers where we are not very sure, so we avoid this, but we are using this in terms of where we need to be or how we need to advocate for certain activities at the national level. So of course we know that there are movement. We can acknowledge the fact that there are some national groups that are more likely to be moving or to try to move to other countries because Spain or Italy were not their first intended destinations. But it's not something that we, I mean, yes, it's an evidence, we have some information, but we don't provide statistics on this phenomenon.
Thank you very much, Laura. I think this is an interesting topic. On a related note, you know, in the European Union, in legal and political terms, they refer to these as secondary movements from the countries, from the external border of the European Union toward other European countries, and it's a hot political potato. As far as I understand, then you collect some such data, but you don't have a clear overview. But as far as I understand, also maybe the French survey, Chris, the survey that Chris was presenting, maybe can actually include those kind of data. But I can see that Laura raised her hand, so please, Laura.
I was just going to add to the point that I think that one of the complications of what Soledad is asking for is that there's a very kind of wide variety of situations encapsulated in the situation that she's mentioning, because obviously if you mean immigrant to Spain that then re-emigrate either to the countries of origin or elsewhere in the world, that could include anywhere in Europe, or it could include the North America, or include other countries in Latin America that were not their countries of origin. So tracking that movement is complicated not just by the diversity of potential secondary destinations, but also the legal status with which they might be moving to those secondary destinations. On the one hand, you have around roughly between 60 and 70%, depending on the kind of base year that you're calculating, of people that have migrated to Spain are of Latin American origin, as we know well. And the vast majority of those have actually entered the country in an authorized manner, and there's variations into whether they have overstayed or they've always remained in the country legally. But very importantly, especially Latin American migrants are able to obtain nationality, Spanish nationality, relatively quickly as compared to those from other countries. And what that actually means is that with Spanish nationality, they can move to any country in the European Union with no restrictions as any other EU citizen. So there wouldn't be, even if IOM wanted and had the budget to track those systems, there wouldn't be an obvious way to do that once we start seeing, for the Spanish case in particular, the complexities of tracking those movements. So the only thing I was going to suggest is you could potentially look at reach and detailed surveys on a number of destination countries that are quite common, especially, for example, for Latin American migrants. You could have a look at TEO, obviously, for France, but there I would expect that those that you can track that have arrived to France coming from Spain would be a very, very small mini subsample of all of the movements that are captured there. You could do the same with a survey that Philippe has actually presented as well, see if some of those Latin American or kind of North African migrants that are in Switzerland have previously been in Spain, and if an equivalent survey existed in Belgium, which it doesn't, as far as I'm aware, you could do the same for Belgium, or you could do, there's some surveys like Understanding Society in the UK that might allow you to capture some of that as well. But it's a very piecemeal sort of work of trying to put together the puzzle and then trying to combine information from multiple surveys. It won't be an easy subject to research from that perspective, or you would need to actually create your own survey data through some form of a kind of snowball type of sampling with all of the complexities that those types of sampling have. So that was just kind of additional piece of information for Soledad.
Yes, indeed, it's a very difficult job. I know there are efforts ongoing among European countries, and they're struggling themselves. Okay, so I don't know if anyone has something to add, or the panelists if they want to add something. Or otherwise, I can just say a big thank you very much to the speakers for being here today and contributing, and Elena for helping organizing, of course, and Laura and the project, and Brinia for making this possible. We have 2 more meetings in the coming weeks. One is on the 8th with the OECD, and another one on the 22nd, if I'm not mistaken, or 29th. Just check the calendar online with the EASO. And again, the calendar is online on the website of Ethmigsurveydata. So please check it, and we hope to see you at the next webinar. Thank you very much.
I use this opportunity also to remind our Spanish-speaking audience that next Tuesday, 1st June at 5 p.m. we also have a webinar specifically dedicated to the surveys that we have uncovered for Spain through the Ethnic and Migrant Minority Survey Registry. That will be in Spanish Tuesday next week at 5 p.m.
Right. Thank you very much, Laura.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.